think I'm going on too long, but I try to, yeah.
You
Sorry.
have more than enough time.
So
I'm
anyway,
just
yeah,
enjoying
okay,
listening
okay.
about
Yeah,
your research.
I read some tips on podcasts. I said, don't talk too long. To surmise it, I thought to myself at that point, I was like, well, so we've got this political context, we've got all this affective forces, we've got this economic marginalization and spatial marginalization. But at the same time,
Yeah.
I'm meeting people who are fairly secure in space and place and willing to share me my worlds about their worlds. So I thought, well, my research was very much just focused on their everyday life, on the detailed things that are happening in the butcher store, in the market, in the street side. And all the while aware that at certain points, of course, the question of the state, the question of these broader structural issues are coming up, but allowing them to come up from people rather than me going in to say, well, what's the Indian state doing to you? Or tell us how it is to be a Muslim. Loaded questions, which methodologically to me seem problematic because they take someone who's an object who's an object of a kind of marginalization process and then ask them to speak for themselves about themselves. Where rather, tell me how you eat. Where do you go? And that was interesting for me because it opened up the city to me. And later on, as I started writing, I thought I started piecing these threads together. And this paper, which you referred to, is kind of an outcome of that, to say, well, where does the political
Absolutely.
emerge?
Yeah, so now getting into halal, how halal becomes molecular, you speak about this in your 2016 article, which is less about visible slaughter, but more about the risks like enzyme traces and cross-contamination. What was that shift like, and what inspired you to explore that question?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so that was, I mean, that's interesting to note, right? The terrain in a kind of an economy like South Africa, which is which is a completely kind of industrialized economy, fairly pretty much completely industrialized in the sense that supermarkets control supply chains all the way from abattoirs and farms to stores. And most shopping is happening in national chain stores or very similar to what you find in the US and Europe.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, the terrain of the city, is a sanitized terrain where one doesn't see animals, where one doesn't see blood. And this also speaks to your earlier question, which I didn't get a chance to, about this whole kind of smellscape and what happens during the cities. So we're living in a city in South Africa where things are concealed, things are closed, you buy packages. It's an information economy, right? Middle class, very prominent middle class Muslim population, very educated. And halal had kind of come in. But what got me into that was much earlier when I was still exploring my first research in anthropology.
And there's a pretty big Muslim population in South Africa, right?
Yes. It's about, it's probably only about 1%, 1.1 to 1.5% of the country. So percentage-wise, Okay, Muslims in South Africa are very kind of overrepresented in the public, from prominent politicians, prominent business people, and a kind of prominent middle class. So a consuming middle class, very visible in public.
Similar to the United States, you would say? Or like the UK?
Perhaps even, maybe somewhat like similar to the UK, but sometimes even more so because South Africa doesn't have, especially after 94, we don't have a kind of a, Islamophobic discourse. So you will very easily just be in a public space and you'll find people in hijab to various kinds of things and, in workspaces. So it's kind of Islam and Muslim life is very much accommodated, even in these kind of so-called secular spaces like corporates or various kinds of things. So I guess similar to what you find in the West. But what was happening that got me into it was not that really. It was just like this question of halal. So like I mentioned, what is it and how it's getting bureaucratized. But behind that was the scholarly thing that came later. What got me into it was actually that I noticed in around 2010 and 11 that around me, the Muslims in my community, friends, family, people were becoming incredibly anxious about halal.
Yeah.
So it was a constant topic of discussion. It was on Muslim radio stations. There were talks in mosques.
Yeah.
People you meet at a family gathering were like, did you hear this toothpaste is not halal? Did you hear about this fresh cream? And that was the interesting thing. People were obsessed about halal, but this halal that they were worried about, they were so concerned about, was halal in things like toothpaste and toothpicks.
Yeah.
And sometimes they were actually concerned. So sometimes, they were actually concerned about halal. And other times they were just really critical about this. Like, what the hell is halal doing? Why is a halal sign on a toothpick or bottled water? So that was actually my intro. That was this kind of, what's happening to halal, right? That we kind of, think of it in all these products.
It's such a fascinating topic. Could you give a little background on what SANHA is, or SANHA is? I don't know how you pronounce that, and how it redefined Taqwa and the concept of Taqwa.
Interesting.
as vigilance and certification, and what that sort of means when we're thinking about the question of piety, in the context of Islam, and
Yeah.
when it's linked to the whole institutional expertise question.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So SANHA was in that research. SANHA quickly emerged as a very important organization. So first, with all this kind of anxieties floating around, SANHA was often at the forefront. So
Yeah.
it was their publications. They had PR people on the radio. They were doing mosque tours around the country, educating people about these kind of, invisible risks, these chemicals that could surreptitiously invade your whole consumption life and, render you almost like napak, render you like a non-Muslim almost, right? So there was like this fear kind of, fear mongering. But SANHA itself, and that was part of their, and people also recognized this as something which was scary to them, the people I spoke to. But SANHA itself is a Deobandi aligned organization founded in 1996. So there's an explosion of halal certification in South Africa after 94, after the end of apartheid. And one reason is got to do with the fact that the non-white Muslim population was free. And so they were able to now leave their areas. They could go to non-Muslim spaces, right? They could go to supermarkets and malls where they were not allowed before. But the other thing was this kind of celebration of culture. South Africa's kind of, the nation is the idea in South Africa, some at the moment starting to fall apart for the last couple of decades. But it's the idea that, you can be whoever you are. You can be whatever religion, you can be whatever culture, and you can celebrate it publicly. So there was a space for kind of public religious expression, and organizations like SANHA came up. So what they did was they bring together ulama and business people, mainly from the South African Indian community up north in Johannesburg and Durban. And they were kind of, the business component is important because the prominent business people in South Africa were very important in this because they understand, of course, right? They understand the new economy. They could see what the kind of transformations were happening, economies of scale, importation from abroad. Also, these were the general, and then also Muslim butchers, very prominent Muslim butchers, Muslim butcher families that some of them who go back up to a century old, in the industry, who were also kind of, been integral to providing Muslims with meat in South Africa, but now observing these kind of changes. What kinds of bureaucratization is coming in? What kinds of importation? What kind of changes are coming in? And then the ulama, who are kind of, together with them, giving them advice on, how to rule on halal in this kind of changing world. So that was their plan. But as they explained it to me, it was also that they're a Deobandi aligned organization. As we know, with the Deobandis, there's a lot of emphasis on Taqwa, right? Protecting the self, being ritually compliant. And so for them, for the ulama, they were also concerned. They were saying, well, look, if the food economy in the world is changing, then halal will change. And if we don't let Muslims know about this, then they will be not practicing halal unknowing to them, right? So they had this one side I think, which maybe I didn't recognize early enough, which I now do recognize, is that this is their practice, right? They are very vigilant. This is how they approach Islam. And they really think of it as a serious issue, right? That Muslims must eat halal and halal is changed. So we need to tell them the new way of halal. At the same time, they were unambiguous about their market, right? They were unambiguous about it. The directors were telling me, listen, in South Africa, if the customer doesn't buy from your shop, the shop will suffer. The shop will come to SANHA and tell SANHA, look, we need a certificate. Right. So part of the approach to taqwa, right? Part of the approach to vigilance about the self, right? Taqwa, which you often translate as God consciousness or piety or awareness, being aware of God in your moments, in your actions, now became being aware of what you eat, being aware of the chemicals on the packaging. And what is interesting about this kind of consumerization of taqwa is that it's very different to kind of earlier iterations of taqwa where if the product is not halal, well, you can simply abstain. You can eat vegetables. You don't have to eat at this fancy shopping mall. So that was where this kind of idea of vigilance, got shifted onto a consumer subject, who now is buying in a vigilant way. But at the same time, I think it comes back to your question of anxiety, because once taqwa, which is an idea very much about the self and about the reflexive self and the good self, is suddenly now about a consumer subject, well, then it's always liable to fall apart at the same time, right? Because you're reliant on, it's actually not about itself in some way. It's always mediated by these kind of complicated world of chemicals and, and enzymes and flavorings, which, as we know from food scandals,
Yeah, this is kind of interesting because what stood out in that article was that whole blend of food science with Quranic verse and then the branding element. Would you describe this as a techno-theological mode of halal governance?
Interesting. Yeah, I think in some way it is, of course, right? It's kind of bringing together, right, your kind of, theological reflections on what we can eat and how we can live in the world with a much more kind of, technocratic concern with simply, with securing the supply chain across large distances and in minority contexts and things like that. But I also think, yeah, I mean, as perhaps you may have seen, I don't know, I also started to think that, when we start to like, use this kind of like techno-theological or
Yeah.
techno-scientific, or, we use these terms, then
Yeah.
we also miss some of the complexity of what's happening, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
And so to give you an example about this was this issue of gelatin, right? So when SANHA differed with the other South African organizations, so many organizations in South Africa said gelatin from non-halal sources, even if the animal is not halal, the gelatin is halal. So they followed a
Yeah.
principle of istihala, which is a Hanafi principle. Now SANHA differed from them, and there's many organizations around the world who said, no, this question of istihala is not happening. And they go to a molecular level to say, well, on a molecular level,
Yeah.
there's no transformation. But interestingly, is that SANHA, through their Deobandi networks, require all their manufacturers in South Africa who want to have halal gelatin to import it from Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I thought this is something quite interesting, right? So they're saying, well, we've got companies in Pakistan who are producing gelatin. All these animals there, we are happy that they are halal. It's a Muslim country. And so therefore, if you want to produce in South Africa, don't buy from the South African manufacturer. Get it from, this Pakistani manufacturers and bring it here. So it shows how it's not just techno-theological. I think on some level, it's also about establishing some kind of terrain, right, within a market.
Yeah.
So say,
Yeah.
well, we will use our Muslim networks, which are no longer now just theological networks, but are also networks of economic power, which we can mobilize against other kinds of interests. And so there's different things happening, I think,
Growing up, I remember that during the 90s, even in the US, there was a huge debate. I mean, there were also Islamic scholars involved who specialized in food, and this question of zabia, non-zabia. But the gelatin question was a huge one because gelatin was in everything. So like Skittles, all these sorts of foods. And I think that's very relevant what you're talking about. And I think what also stood out was, how like there's this sort of counter public that forms, right? And in the sense that, or, like a counter public or vernacular piety or anxiety, as you mentioned earlier, where certain consumers even override certification, relying on their own ethics or distrust, right? And I wonder how you saw that play out in your research.
Interesting.
Like how do you interpret those concepts of counter publics, vernacular piety, and anxiety, I guess you could say?
Interesting. Okay. Counter publics, vernacular piety. Okay, that's interesting. I don't particularly use those terms, but I think it's it definitely, I think so. If one thinks of a counter public, right, there's a move towards the kind of a certification, which I describe now. There's a technical, scientific mode of halal, this molecular halal. I'm assuming you're speaking about a counter public as people who go against that. Or kind of so vernacular kind of different ways
like
of
who
going against.
Override the certification,
absolutely,
like bring their own sort of approach to the question of halal.
So what I tried to do, sorry.
So
what I was interested in from very early on was this idea that where certification introduces a mode of halal. What I saw through these kind of SANHA attempts was that certification is in fact perhaps the counter public. It emerges at a particular point in time, creates a whole new set of scientific and technical ideas about halal, and then has made big inroads into Muslim everyday life to try and convince people or alert them and educate them about this new terrain. And so what was interesting was that when I was speaking to ulama, in South Africa, unlike many anthropologists, so many anthropologists at the time were writing, well, no, halal has just emerged. There was no such thing as halal before. Nobody cared about it. Look, the Muslims were in Europe and America in the 60s. This was not an issue. All of a sudden, it's come up in the neoliberal age, and they have various arguments about it. But of course, when one speaks to the ulama and the people I was interviewing, and even just from kind of experience, one knows that halal is not something that just comes up in the 1980s. It's a very old ritual practice and has certain very complicated forms of reasoning, right? And so that was also something I took from scholars like Talal Asad, who were trying to say, well, look, to understand Muslim, to do an ethnography of Islam, it's not just to see what Muslims do, it's not just to see what they wear or what they say, but it's also to pay attention to the forms of reasoning. What are the actual operations of thought? What is the logic and this embodied logic, embodied reasoning that people engage in when they do very ordinary things? So whether it's we can think of things like humility or deference to authority and hierarchy. As scholars, we were talking about Arsalan Khan the other day. It shows that Tabligh Jamaat in a very interesting way. It's not something that whole deference to authority doesn't come out of the now, right? It's something that has its own historical precedents, right? I'm trying to think of the right word, a past. So I try to treat halal in the same way to show that, well, there is this idea of halal. And in this idea of halal, as one picks it up before certification emerges, there's a very strong idea that actually if another Muslim sells you halal, well, it is halal. And people will say that it is a sin or a makruh, detestable or completely guna. It depends on who you're talking to even doubt another Muslim. So this made me start to think, well, if people are saying, right, that it's actually, you're not allowed to doubt somebody else, right? But then if you consume and the other person cheated you, well, they're the ones that bear responsibility, in terms of salvation responsibility, in terms of they bear the sin for your transgression. There's some kind of reason, there's a kind of a halal reason or a kind of a peculiar kind of idea of trust that has been historically embedded within this practice of halal. So while we have these rituals, you're supposed to do this and you're supposed to do this, at the moment of consumption, I don't really know whether this person has done it or not. Right? And this question of knowing, right? And it's kind of so it crosses kind of a theological, epistemological level, right? On the one hand, on a theological level, well, only God really knows, and we do these things for God. On epistemological level, it's also a question of what can you really know? How are you going to, if you get something in the market, if you go to a friend's house, at what level are you going to go to say that I know that you have done halal? So halal trust or halal reason that situates itself in the middle to say that, well, trust in halal is kind of a suspended between absolute certainty and absolute doubt. Neither do I doubt everybody where I go around. I accept that they're Muslim, that their food is halal, and I can never really have absolute certainty about it because it's about a question of community, about relationships and trust. I was thinking about this as a kind of almost like a triadic kind of relational model, right? So you've got people interacting with each other, and then but all under some kind of divine theological will. And halal and certification comes in and changes this. So what people are doing, what you are calling vernacular piety or the counter-public, I try to argue, is that many times they're actually mobilizing an established tradition of halal. It's a tradition that's not written down, but it's so widespread. It's not written down like in one book.
That's very important to